Nigeria is currently ranked among sub-Saharan African countries as heavily indebted with a stunted GDP growth rate, retarded export growth rate, fast dwindling income per capita, and an increasing poverty level. As of March 2021, Nigeria's total public debt had already hit 33.1 trillion naira. That's about $87.24 billion, which is an accumulation of borrowings from successive governments, of which most were borrowed since the return to democratic rule in 1999. The country's public debt has continued to trend upwards with a drop of 7.6 trillion naira, that's about $48.7 billion in 2012 to 32.9 trillion naira, $86.8 billion in 2020. While external borrowings in recent times started gaining momentum as it surged from 1 trillion naira in 2012 to 12.7 trillion naira, 39% of total debt in 2020. Similarly, total debt service to revenue ratio jumped from 12.3% in 2012 to 40.3% in 2020. However, the sharp decline in government's revenue has become a major concern as federal government reportedly spent over 83% of its revenue for last year. The total revenue earned in 2020 was much less than projected, while it spent 3.26 trillion naira on debt servicing. Now joining me now via Zoom to look at this and of course other issues relating to debt and debt sustainability is the lead researcher at the Debt Management Roundtable of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. That's Mr. Wilson Erumebor. It's good to see you, Mr. Erumebor. Good afternoon to you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, these figures are really, really alarming. I went through them earlier today when you talk about debt and where Nigeria stands. How would you assess our current debt profile and how sustainable is the current borrowing spree?
Well, what you've done so far is basically to show us the fact that we have a huge debt. I mean, if you go back to 2013, I mean, we had a case where our total debt was about 10 trillion naira. Fast forward back to 2020, even as at the first quarter of 2021, we've had 33.1 trillion. I mean, that's more than a threefold increase in our debt profile. Mind you, these are figures that is released by the Debt Management Office. Which means that there are other forms of debt that are not included in this 33 trillion naira that I just cited, which you also mentioned during your opening remarks. So if you look at CBN's ways and means, I mean that has hit about 15.5 trillion naira, which is almost about 47% of the DMR's 33 trillion. So if you add that, I mean, you're almost, approaching 48.5% or thereabout. If you also look at other forms of debt like the AMCON liabilities, which is 5.6 trillion. If you also look at the current fiscal deficit for the year for this 2021 budget, which is also 5.6 trillion. By the time you sum up all of these, we're looking at something close to 60 trillion naira worth of debt that Nigeria has at the moment, which is very worrying, especially with the fact that there are even more plans to raise and increase borrowing. If you look at the debt management strategy, there are plans to increase debt, to finance the budget, given the revenue challenge. So yes, it's worrying and it's not in any way sustainable, because if we continue at this pace of debt accumulation, of course, we could be heading towards a debt crisis. And that's the message we are sending at the DMR, Debt Management Roundtable. This
debt issue, according to research, was not like this until middle 70s when we started seeing that rise from 1.5 billion to 2.5 billion and all of that. But is Nigeria's debt accumulation growth enhancing or wearing for the economy?
Well, some would argue, typically almost every economist agrees that debt is good for growth. You need debt to finance growth, to finance economic activities. But at the same time, there are two areas, two key reasons when your debt is good. First of all is the fact that if you are borrowing to finance productive activities, And secondly, if repaying your debt will not put significant pressure on your assets, whether on your on your revenue, then you can argue that debt is good. But for those two reasons, I mean, there are so many reasons not to think that it's not good for Nigeria, especially given the fact that almost 98% of the revenue we earned, in the first 5 months of this year, went into servicing debt. That means that it's adding so much pressure, on our revenue. So in that sense, and again, there's also a non-linear relationship, if you want to go into econometrics and all that, between growth and debt. What that means is that there is debt might be good for growth at the early point of development, but it gets to a stage where debt can be so high. Too much of debt, simply put, is not good for growth. For the case of Nigeria, we've seen where we had a debt forgiveness situation in 2005, but from then till now, the pace of accumulation of debt has been significant and rapid. On the growth part, you see that the highest growth we've recorded in the last 5 years since the 2016 recession was 2.3%, which we recorded in 2019. But meanwhile, we've been accumulating so much debt since 2012, 2013 period. So why aren't we seeing that much impact on growth is something that needs to be asked and explored. So in other words, it means that what exactly are we using this debt for? I mean, there are issues with, right now we're even borrowing more to finance recurrent expenditures, which is significantly and seriously worrying, when you look at the numbers.
But in 2019, I see that Nigeria and Ghana recorded highest domestic debt in ECOWAS. That's about $147.2 billion and $49.7 billion US dollars, respectively. That's based on some estimates from the International Monetary Fund. Yes. Now, what are the fiscal implications of these scenarios for both countries?
Well, currently, if you look at the IMF data, you'd realize that Ghana is, almost at the high risk level. I think they're even approaching a debt distress point, which means that there will be significant challenges in repaying those debts. But for Nigeria, we're probably at the high risk level. I mean, we in-house here at the DMR computed a debt index, which basically looks at a composition of debt to GDP ratio, debt service to revenue ratio, external debt to export ratio, and two other debt sustainability indicators. So we put all of them into one index and created a threshold. And we realized that Nigeria is at the high risk point, very close. In fact, that we're not just considering debt to GDP, which is a bit low, but we're also including debt service to revenue crisis. Now, if you look at the experience of, say, Greece, for instance, during the global financial crisis in 2008, you see, debt crisis does not just start, when you wake up one morning and it just happens. No, it comes with, years of early warning signs. You get to a point where local interest rates would increase significantly. The need to even pay back debt. So you end up in a debt cycle where you are basically borrowing to pay back your debt. You borrow from A to pay B. And some of those signs, we're seeing that already here in Nigeria. So we don't have to get to a point where debt to GDP exceeds 100% before we need to get